Are you ready? She's off.
Yep,
I shall
yep.
mute my
It's
mics.
it's coming on. Sorry, folks.
I don't know why you're panicking.
Um, Bloody hell. Uh, uh, yeah, give me a second. Am I ready?
I don't know why you're panicking.
Um, Bloody hell. Uh, uh, yeah, give me a. Excuse me. All right. All righty now. Hello. It is 19 October, Weekly Marx. We're looking now at Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Unless you think I've gone into a time warp because we were looking at the 1864 to 5 manuscripts, there's a reason for doing this, and part of it has to do with looking at some pivotal texts, pivotal commentaries, and um, and to prepare for what we're going to do for a while, and that is read the manuscripts of 61 to 63, but from a particular point of view. And as usual, I'm trying to focus on rent because that's the thing I'm working on. So it is called Volume 30, Economic Works 1861 to 63, the manuscripts, a contribution to the critique of political economy, third chapter, Capital in General, notebooks 1 to 7, and uh, and we're looking at a part of it anyway. But I included all the links to this, and we'll go through this eventually. What was important, of course, is theories of surplus value and its relation to, more specifically, rent. And so, anyway, I'm going back to the a critical text, which is referred to by a lot of people, Enrique de Sell, or and um, going to look at a more specific chapter, of course, the rent chapter, the theory of rent. But before we get there, and partially because I'm just a little obsessed with graphs and diagrams and charts, I'm going to go through the charts first and then get to uh, the text itself, maybe. This is going to take a few minutes, and I think uh, we have to do something exactly at the top of the hour. So I will try and be brief. Anyway, this is DeSalle's text, and the manuscripts of 1861 to 63 have a variety of parts. There's volume 1, volume 3. Um, the references in volume 1 of Capital, the references from volume 3 that he's working on, and of course the MECW, which is the Marx Engels collected works. And so there's all these references here. And the important point, of course, is that it's worked on in this kind of order and that it has a relationship to very specific texts and certain ideas. Um, anyway, the point is it's 61 to 63, and on the one hand, it has numbers for pages, but on the other hand, it jumps around a little bit. And note, of course, as does DeSalle, that the full draft of Volume 3 was written in the manuscripts of 1864 to 65, which is what we were looking at before the folks Mosley translation. Now, what was more interesting, of course, or whatever, is this idea that things are written not only at home, but when he's sitting in the library of the British Museum. And the British Library is no longer there. It's across the street or down the road anyway, and is in a whole separate building. I think they've kept the reading room, which is nice, but they did remodel everything, as I understand it. So anyway, that there are notebooks from 1851 to 56. The Grundrisse is written from 1857 to 58 at home. There more of the Grundrisse is written in Notebook 7. And then everything comes together in notebooks 1 through 5, or 1 through 5 is written at home, 61 to 62. So this is the form of studying and writing the manuscripts. And now onto the diagrams, which you may find a little tedious, I suppose. But I would assert that they are actually, for me, they're very useful because they put out. I mean, for example, when we were looking at subsumption this past week, it would have been nice to have a some sort of diagram, and this diagram actually helps with explaining what we did earlier this week with subsumption. So here is figure 2, development of the concept and constitution of simple and complex categories. And so the deal here is to try and get to surplus value, of course, and what constitutes it. That is, there is value, and as we've looked in Marx, and as was referred to in the subsumption text, and that is, there is something called living labor, the creative source, the reality in which we pretty much live. There is, of course, objectified past labor, which is variable capital. It's going to work. Um, uh, we get wages. A component of that is unpaid time. Living labor is, of course, a productive force. The labor power, as Marx talks about it, as we've talked about it, is labor capacity, for which we get wages, and then there's the necessary time, which is the part that gets extracted, surplus time, surplus labor, from the unpaid time, right? Which is what's being exploited. And here, surplus value is still value. It is composed of exchange and use value. And as this points out, is it's a set of simple categories, and doesn't seem very simple, of course, here, but um, it is the difference between living labor, um, or actual labor, and the capacity of labor, which is labor power, which is where all the extraction is coming from, but it still relates to, of course, living labor. Um, and what is being paid for is objectified past labor. Now, I'm not going to explain all of this here. The point is that this is similar to what Marx does in Volume 2, and that is Department 1 and Department 2, production and circulation, the circuits of capital. And I'll go through quickly the explanation. There are a lot of arrows and it moves all over the place and blah, 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 blah. And you'll note that one circuit is within another. And capitalist S1 buys B with money, M1, a commodity C1 from the proprietor S2, C1, S2, see? M1, C1, S2. They sell it, or sells it, excuse me, with C1, he produces C2, which he sells S to the consumer, S3, who consumes it, X, obtaining a greater amount of money, M2, and the value V1 has increased. And then R is reproduction. So this goes left to right. Here's R. Excuse me. So this is sort of the moments in which stuff happens, primarily described in volume 2 of Capital. Now, from this past week, we were talking about, since Cecilia was talking about totality. And as a term, this is kind of what it looks like. There is totality, the totality of capital, that is. It becomes or is, here's the living labor we were just talking about. Here's the labor power or labor capacity. Um, New value is created from the exteriority, that is the not capital stuff, that is labor capacity, living labor, raw materials, etc. All that's outside of the totality in that sense. Uh, and what we get from this is surplus labor, of course, and we get to surplus value as described in the above thing. So, number one is the working day, necessary time. Um, Number two is the components parts of capital. That is, we've talked about this before, that uh, objectified labor, that is money, M, is under capital is both constant capital, that is machines and stuff, and then of course there's labor, that is what was here, and the necessary time being used in to make capital. And then there's number two is the wage that we get for such work, which is part of the variable capital, right? It's all here, right, where the arrows go. This is the means of production. Means of production are composed of constant capital, variable capital, machines, and people. And then there's raw materials, which are also part of capital. A, preserves value. B, reproduces value. The reproduction occurs in, our putting our labor into this stuff. And number three is the value of the product, which is composed of C, V, and S. The surplus, the constant and variable capital, the non-living labor is a new totality. And so the boundary of the totality, this is DeSelle's chart, not mine. This is the boundary between that which is the kind of the real world that we live in and the formation of capital. The new totality of capital, that is non-living labor, is living labor that we put in. We sell our labor capacity for wages. This is important because it is necessary time, and we combine that with, or the capital combines this with the means of production as variable capital and becomes a new totality. Categories and levels required to understand the operation of surplus value in general. Now, one of the terms that comes from the text we were looking at this past week was the idea of subsumption, and the division it was between, or the difference was created between formal subsumption and real subsumption. And, since Cecilia talks at that at great length and convinces us, hopefully, that this is a development that Marx takes from Kant and Hegel, and makes it more material in that sense. So in this chart, we have isolated lives of work of laborers, A, B, C, and N. We have a manufacturer or factory. We have L1, L2, L3, LN, that is specifically different labors that are done when, you're working of people, different people do different things in a factory, but subsumption does occur in this process. This is the whole point, is that in formal subsumption, we get each isolated laborer reproduces the value of his labor capacity. This is labor power converted. Cooperation, external unity, sociability in the workshop. That is, this is cooperation, collective action in that sense, and also described as formal subsumption. And then the division of labor, as Adam Smith talks about, is the social divisions of social labor in manufacturing. The different divisions of labor, to make a pen or whatever. That's L1, L2, L3, Ln. And then the real subsumption is occurs with other kinds of processes, that is, to get to the product. That is, there are different machines, M1, M2, Mn, and abstract labors actually subsumed. That is, this is this idea that, as Saint Cecilia was talking about, is this question of abstraction, of how, and we've talked about this before in other contexts. That is, whether it was Marx talking about the labor process itself, but there's a series of abstractions that occur, or that it's talked about in the abstract. And this idea of the abstract, of course, goes back to Kant and Hegel. This idea of stuff can be hidden within that process. That it's not all as palpable to us, but yet it does happen. And this is what happens. Real subsumption occurs in terms of mechanical or industrial sociality in the factory. That is real subsumption. So the comparison here is, of course, the difference between, of course, workshop and factory, where the process, the relations change, or that a new abstraction occurs because of capital. And, anyway, so this is the character of labor and its degrees of subsumption, that at one level, within the context of, originally there was a kind of formal subsumption under feudalism that was more about the workshop. But as we get manufacturing and new divisions of social labor, this gets separated, and that's where exploitation comes in. So anyway, and we won't go through this at great detail, but notebooks 1 through 5, August 61 to 62, and this is what he covers there is production process of capital, transformation of money into capital, absolute surplus value, relative surplus value, cooperation, as we saw above, division of labor, and beginning of the section on machinery. That's why it's divided up this way in terms of labor being a new kind of subsumption occurs when machines are introduced. And that's the whole point of Marx, right? The idea that capital gets transformed because of history and the creation of new forms of capital. Anyway, Marx goes on to write notebooks 6 to 14 of the theories of surplus value. That's what is of interest here, is the idea that theories of surplus value introduce or concretize of the kinds of discussions that Marx makes about rent, and he's comparing a variety of folks who discuss it. Smith, Ricardo, Roberta Stewart, as I recall, and etc., whatever. Bunch of folks. And anyway, then there's notebooks 5 and 19 to 23, which discuss surplus value, continuation of the discussion of machinery, because eventually the thing on machinery becomes a discussion about what's the effect as more machines substitute for human labor, et cetera. The relationship between absolute and relative surplus value, these making the distinction between um, the idea of the workday. The working day is essentially being discussed, right? You either increase the working day or you make people work harder. You extract more work via time. And the distinction between formal and real subsumption, which is what we went on endlessly with since to Cecilia this past week. And then finally, which is the whole point of all of this, is accumulation. So it's the place of the subject of volume 1 of Capital within the context of the notebooks. So all of this gets reintegrated by Marx and Engels into trying to produce Capital. The volume 1, which we now have a new translation of, which sort of sorts out some of the other issues and makes it a little less clunky. Term. And here is I had call that in the Cecilia book. There was a lot of discussion about mediating things. That is, the mediations between surplus value and profit. And here is the difference among categories. More specifically, from competition, the price of the commodity refers to cost price, which is category 2. And from production, the value of the product is determined by the market value. That is, you get to, there's a way in which you can relate from not only production on this is department 1, and there it has within the context of circulation, market value gets established by competition, by circulation, and that cycles back into cost price. But anyway, it's cost of production, cost price, surplus value, average profit, price of production, that is the cost price, that is competition and production here. The market value established within the context of the market because it's a commodity. The market price, which is not identical, is the price of production and the market price, and then profit. And yes, it's a little more complicated than gnomes stealing underwear. Living labor, creative source. The value A is value commodity, wages, profit, and rent have relationships to the value of the commodity. Surplus value and profit, creative source of value and sources of revenue. So there's the source of revenue, the component parts of the value or price of the commodity, and the general abstract form of the surplus value. So what is the value of the commodity represents these two elements, that is wages, profit, and rent, and living labor. And A and B are, compressed from all that other jazz we're looking at above. Now, you don't have to remember any of that or this. Hopefully you get a sense of all of the different relations here. The income of the capitalist comes from profit. It gets accumulated or put in the money bin or whatever. And then also, growth occurs, expanded reproduction occurs. And relative to value, new use values, wages plus profit plus fund of reproduction are the income of the capitalist. And then they are composed, the wages come from new use value. The component parts of value reappear in the reproduction process. There's simple reproduction, which simple reproduction means it goes back into maintaining your machines, etc. And you see that's constant capital, and there are machines in there. And the example he uses is the spinning factory. There's circulating capital, right? Labor currently added, plus the raw materials, plus machinery. Variable capital plus constant capital. Constant capital is, as Marx has discussed, raw material, and machinery, which is fixed capital. Not necessarily identical to constant capital because of the issue of raw materials, not quite the same. So variable capital plus constant capital. variable capital comes from living labor, which we've discussed above. Um, the reproduction for the variable capital, that is labor, you get, wages, etc., and reproduces received salary. And there you get, here is the idea that labor power rather than living labor is being used. Living labor is actually being used in the spinning and operating the machines, but note that it is variable capital applied to constant capital, but it's not, it's the labor itself, but the abstraction that we're talking about here is this idea of labor capacity or labor power being ultimately exploited. So there are layers of abstraction, as the diagram shows. Um, this is Notebook 7, some moments of the description of reproduction in Notebook 7. Now, this is the relationships of circulation, Department 2, in Volume 2. In the Marxian commentary, and that is there's a landlord. Yep, there is a landlord and a capitalist farmer. The capitalist agriculture manipulating the farmer F because of the way this is owned. We talked about this before, about the even in the early texts, Marx is talking about the relationship between the landlord and workers or farmers, more particularly in terms of land. And then there is, with the creation or formation of industry, we have what Marx might refer to as a sterile class. Uh, what does the industrial capitalist do? But rather just, manages all this stuff. This is that command thing that Sesta Cecilia was talking about in his text. And then the working class is used as opposed to, farmer or farmers. So there is the proletarianization occurs because of these kinds of things. So the relationships of circulation can be seen schematically in that way. And yes, you don't have to remember any of these numbers or stuff, but this is kind of what Marx is talking about, the difference between the means of consumption, that is, you need wages and et cetera, and it comes from all the things we were looking at before. Product is produced, but the components of it are constant capital, variable capital, and surplus value. Um, this is the means of production, which need to be seized, of course. um, and reproduction as a whole, that is, thinking about it as a circulatory process. It's not simply one moment of production and circulation, but a whole series of them. And so reproduction as a whole is this third idea here. So where IP equals industrial profit, P equals profit, IN equals interest. Well, and a key element, of course, is this idea of interest, that a way in which we can talk about, profit, etc. R equals rent, constant capital, and variable capital. So all of that's there. Constant capital, variable capital here. Variable capital, obviously, wages go to workers. The constant capital, raw material, etc., gets transformed into the product. Um, R is that component, this rent, which has a relationship to interest and to the product itself, and also to surplus value. So all of that, the things I'm fiddling around with, are this little section here. And not neglecting all of this other stuff, because all this other stuff goes with it. So in a different way, we can talk about rent as a differential as opposed to absolute rent, which is what we were looking at, the difference between uh, differential rent 1 and differential rent 2, and absolute rent is anyway. Explanation: numbers 1, 2, etc. indicate hypothetical amounts of value with a purely pedagogical purpose. We have respected Marx's names for the time being. This is, just as a kind of contingency, without anticipating further precisions and without clarifying. This is Dussel, of course. These are all from Dussel's commentary, without clarifying his ambiguities. And, that what most of us spend time, or some of us spend time doing, is trying to sort all that out. So you go from the there is the imminent value. We talked about imminent imminence and imminent creation, the imminent value of the product. And remember, subsumption still includes all this stuff, or is produced, as it were, by this, and is composed of necessary labor, surplus value, average profit, and the production cost. And rent is derived from these combinations of things. The average profit, the production cost, are part of creating rent, or estimating what rent might be, and also the necessity of having average price, which requires sort of thinking about general average profit, which is what Marx talks about. And then, of course, in more specifically relative to rent on the ground or landed property or whatever, there's the average price of the agricultural product. And I know that's all very horribly complicated, but the point is, price allows us, it has some, as I have referred to it before, indexical relation um, to value. And this is sort of sorting out where value is and its relationship to necessary labor, etc. All right, surplus profit realized over average profit. So surplus profit comes somehow out of that, yes. And this is, remember, we looked at those categories before, and this is sort of rearranging 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Market value, market price, value, the big V value, right? And a kind of set of relations to cost price. That is, cost price is the cost of production and the price of production. And then the formation process of categories and their necessary mediations. And so, some of that is here, competition among branches, general rate of profit, competition within a branch. So their scale is at work, and they are necessary mediations, this mediations that were discussed in the Sans de Cecilia text. Now, this, seems a little complicated, I suppose, but differential rent is not identical to absolute rent, because it requires all of these other thinking about it. And more specifically, the idea of, as within the context of what Saint Cecilia was talking about and what Marx is talking about in terms of Ricardo, and that is the differences among types of land, right? So some land, there's the ABCD of different plots of land with different fertility. And so explanation is CP is the cost of production. V1 is the indirect value on the best land. V3 here is the individual value on the worst land. Remember, we were talking about the difference. Marx goes on tediously giving numbers for what happens on the difference between the worst land and the best land. MV is market value. Ultimately, there is the market. R is the total rent. That's here. Excuse me, which is equal to X and Y. Z up here is negative differential rent on the worst land. And so market price is here, cost of production is here, cost price is sort of explicated that way. Now, here's a different way of looking at it relative to the progressive fetishization of capital from deeper to more superficial. And the idea is the deepness of it is in the production process where everything is, right? There's money, wage labor, means of production, surplus value, S, which is somewhere in there. P, capital P, product. C is commodity. And R equals rent. So rent is here in this funny little relation to as a means of comes from the means of production relative to industrial capital. C is the commodity as Marx has described it. The whole thing is about forming a commodity relative to money. Money is a commodity um, as a commodity form, as it were, and the issue, of course, is that interest-bearing capital comes from all of this. So there's capital that is interest-bearing. There's commercial capital relative to this is on the capitalist side. This is commercial capital, as in, the commodity in the market. That's where you begin to assign prices and blah, blah, blah. And then back at the factory, there is industrial capital itself, which has all of these little things going on. And of course, there is Department One, the production process, and Department Two, the circulation process. So it all kind of fits, sort of. Um, the superficiality, of course, is that it, these things are more abstract, right? Interest-bearing capital is just not quite the same thing as the commercial capital. It just, you don't sort of see the interest-bearing capital. You sort of see the commercial capital relative to money out there, and but what you mainly see is a superficial version of the industrial capital represented by the commodity. Now, we're back to the original kind of equation uh, that we had. So this is pre-capital, the miser or the hoarding of money, money as money, right? Uh, doubloons or whatever, shekels. Um, we have uh, commodity. We have the labor power that we were talking about before, LP. This, remember, the familiar thing, the means of production and labor power and combined to production. And that's A. B is the merchant, the commodity as a commodity. And the idea is that a commodity prime and money prime, this is the world of capital where you begin to use capital, um, where capital is increased or augmented or created, and of course makes more money at the end. M, C, M, and then of course C is where stuff goes on at more abstract levels. The things that Marx is talking about, the functions of industrial capital. There's money capital and commodity capital. There's the relative autonomous element of how capital operates. There's money dealing capital, you know, where you're exchanging money, where money circulates or moves around, and currency gets transformed, et cetera, et cetera. And B, capital that deals with the commodities themselves. So it operates at a money dealing capital level, but also capital has obviously relates to commodities. And here we are back at M, C, M prime, right? M, C, M prime, still M, C, M prime. Now, commercial capital in general, Z, capital Z, is here, combining all of this mess. Development of terminology related to money capital, and commercial capital, right? Difference between C and D. And there's a relative autonomy of money because, it moves around and it's relatively neutral, as it were. All right. Anyway, and cost price and the price of production, which is important to Marx, right? PC is the cost of production here. A is the direct cost of production here. That's direct costs. B is the merchant profit. MP over here is the cost of production. CP is the cost price. So this is what's being sort of related to in terms of trying to estimate what cost price is. SPP here is the selling price of the producer or the buying price of the merchant. So, right, producers and merchants. And IP here, so MP, IP, and A are all part of the same thing, right? They're different phases in the process. SPP is the selling price of the producer or buying price of the merchant. IP is the industrial profit, right? SPM is the selling price for the merchant. And of course, MP is merchant profit. PP is the price of production, which is not described here, but that's kind of what it's there. Um, it shows a bad whatever. This is all still Enrique de Sal, and I don't go through at great length about this, but this does describe capitalist who produces means of subsistence. The commercial shopkeeper, SH and L, SH and L. SH is the commercial shopkeeper, L is labor. Okay. Number 2 here is the capitalist who produces the means of production. Number 3 is the capitalist who produces gold or silver. So here we see the thing kind of created and another thing introduced, or a variety of the idea of what counts as money. And there are people who go and dig in mines and get gold and silver, etc. And part of the whole scarcity business of it all. M2 is the money used to purchase means of subsistence. That's this over here. M3 is the reflux of money done by, of course, the shopkeeper, etc. Stuff goes on there. M4, not the road, is the purchase of the means of production. M5 is the gold and silver. L1 is the living labor sold. C1 is the commodity of industrial capital, means of subsistence, which is also the means of subsistence, right? And C2 is the same commodity to the consumer. That is, labor is a consumer, also buys from the shopkeeper, right? And C3 is the merchant means of production. C3, where the hell is it? Oh, here, C3. The merchant, in other words, has a relationship to, of course, the original thing that is used as money, or gold coins, in other words, are there. So this is the reflux, as in acid reflux, of money in capitalist reproduction. So it circulates within these multiple triangles among 5 different things: among the capitalist, among the commercial shopkeeper, among labor, among the capitalist who produces the means of production, that is, the person who either digs the gold or silver, or gets the raw materials, or brings the machinery. And then 3 is peeled off here to create the capitalist who produces the gold or silver, goes out and mines it or whatever, introduces it into the market. So if you haven't been confused already, then there is the plan of 59 to 61, the plan of January of 63, notebooks 19 to 22, Capital, Volume 1, sections 1872. So you can see that there was a plan at one moment to try and do stuff, and then adds in, as you can see, more stuff. Absolute and relative surplus value, wage, labor, and surplus value, formal and real subsumption, and which is why there are a lot of gaps or what people talk about, like sense to Cecilia, and the productive and unproductive labor. Um, the things yet to have been created or that get kicked down the road, reconversion of surplus value into capital. This is the reflux, right? Reconversion of surplus value accumulation, result of the production process. And so at some moment, 1872, we have where we are, progressive articulation of the definite plan of parts of volume one. Ultimately, if your goal is to create volume one in all of its subsections, you can see all of the different things that went into it. That it just didn't, it just didn't all come from his head or whatever. He was writing manuscripts to try and fit into the big project. And this is a sub concept here, is the idea of the difference between and we saw this discussed before, right? Marx discusses it before, handicraft workshop tools. Um, it's formally different, but materially identical. Things are here, similarly here, uh, as opposed to different formally, whereas everything is more identical. More standardization is different materially, but formally identical, whereas this is materially identical and formally different. And that is the difference between working in workshops and their relationship to the manufacturing process and the industrial factory. Noting, of course, that in the 19th century, um, as I've mentioned before, long ago, and the example that some people use, and there's literature for this, there's actually research done on this, on small artisanal shops that are still part of the industrial factory. So if you're making elevators, for example, you need to have springs, at the top and the bottom, because to catch or bounce the elevator, to cushion the elevator. And the point is that the springs are not necessarily made in the same place as the elevators. So you have smaller shops that manufacture at a smaller scale, and et cetera. And of course, there's the difference between corporations and capital are defined this way: dialectical transformation from handicap workshop to manufacture and the industrial factory. And is the critique of political economy from the exteriority of living labor. What is this relation? The exteriority, living labor, we're the living labor. And then there's A, B, C, D, N, some of which is different positions, critical positions of living labor in the development of the concept of capital, and as has been mentioned in multiple texts, the constitution of categories. So the creation of the categories is rooted back into, as it were, Kant, and um, further articulated by Hegel, and then, of course, retransformed or made more material by Marx. And so, constitution of categories, the analytic knowledge, that's what, when you start creating categories, right, you're creating the differences Kant talks about between the analytic and the synthetic. It is a multiple process. And so you can see here there is a reciprocal relationship and a movement, a series of discussions, starting with Petty, uh, sort of configured by the physiocrats and by Smith. So the categories modify, they move, they integrate new categories into the categorical framework, which is the whole business here. And remember, this is the idea of concept that we get from Hegel. And the progress or passage of movement of dialectical knowledge is this movement from A through N. Anyway, there's a lot here. So it's development of the concept. And remember, this is concept in the Hegelian sense, right? The idea, right? And the constitution of categories, which is Kant. And ultimately, this gets to the big picture, that is the global international social relations and domination of the world system, competition within the world market, which is where Marx was headed. Recall that's the kind of the structure of capital was, or the whole text was ultimately to get to trade, problems of the international and, of course, the colonial, which is a subset of that. So there's a tendency towards a national monopoly, which does exist, and in the context of settler capitalism, et cetera, settler colonialism. And what's going on here, of course, is transfers of surplus value, a less developed to a more developed national capital, right? And which is manifest in a tendency towards national and world monopoly, which is kind of what goes on. Um, we have going on this transfer of surplus value through international competition, which is what's going on in trade and the global market. So yes, we finally got to the end, and I've got to stop in a second here. Dussel, Enrique Dussel, um, puts in a appendix 1, which includes the original notebooks pages, the MEGA, the stuff from the latest version of the Marx Engels collected work, Gesamt whatever, and the collected works is this is the MECW. So this is the trying to correlate all the different sections and their related pages in the originals. And yes, you don't have to, it's not going to be on the test. Anyway, so that's there. And I culled out from the index the rent sections, aside from the chapter, which is the theory of rent. And I've come to the end of my little discussion here. These what we're going to discuss next, which is probably on Saturday, or I may discuss it during the week, and that is the theory of rent, notebooks 10 to 12 from June to August. This is the MECW version, and this is chapter 7 from Dussel, with the sections from Marx and, of course, the diagrams in C2. So there's lots of explanation for all those abstract charts I just showed, which I've yammered on for about 45 minutes. So that's what today's little reading is about, and I hope that you'll get something out of it. And we'll discuss this next Saturday. Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63. Recall that we were looking at 64 to 65, which concretizes certain ideas, maybe not to the extent that we wanted, but this provides a more schematic version of what happens sort of before that. And ultimately, it seems like we're working backwards, but we're not really working backwards. We're simply seeing everything in context. We're sort of, as it were, deconstructing the ideas. All right, so I'm ready to stop, as you may have hoped. Let me stop